Hi, I'm Stacey Rennie, and I am presenting the argument in opposition to the proposition, be it resolved that an effective international legal system exists. I will be arguing on the following points of tension in the field of international law, that is, the lack of a formal constitutional structure, a decentralized organizational structure, voluntary participation and consent, and sovereignty and equality of nations. Although the lack of a constitutional structure has been typified as a marker of the international legal system, and the UN enjoys near universal participation by the world states, the UN Charter does not provide any formal lawmaking powers of its own. It has no generally available means of enforcement, no coercive measures that can be brought to bear on its subjects for breaches of the law. Instead, nations must rely on consensual dispute resolution mechanisms and political or economic pressure brought to bear on the offending states. This limits the powers of the UN General Assembly to discussing and making recommendations on questions or matters within scope of the UN Charter. Curry observes that this can be seen as reducing it to no more than a voluntary moral or ethical code of conduct. The UN does provide a permanent forum for sustained international dialogue and diplomacy, while their jurisdiction is limited to providing advisory opinions to various UN organs and agencies. Those organs of the UN that can impose binding measures, such as the UN Security Council, have authority only over member states, and although there may be a pursuit of law-finding in these sustained forums of dialogue and diplomacy, they are not law-creating, and without the capacity to enforce, I argue that there cannot be a formal governance in place. A decentralized structure in international law assumes an equal distribution of power between nations. If, however, all nations hold ultimate authority, history has shown that nations will use this to perpetuate themselves and their self-interests, leading to potentially substantial impasses. There is also a lack of precision inherent in the decentralized nature of international law that is a result of a confusing multitude of unilateral claims that can strain and weaken the effectiveness of the system. In these ways, the international legal system is again a mechanism for political negotiating, and even in that capacity is vulnerable to abuse from individual nations, resulting in an ineffective system at best. Although the majority of nation-states participate in the UN as a member, it is clear from conduct and behavior of individual nations even today that they have so far resisted the establishment of any world government with law-making, much less law-enforcing, organs. Curry argues that they draw their binding force merely from the consent of parties to be bound rather than from actual performance or on-the-ground commitment to their principles. The fact that nations consent to participation in UN processes does not necessarily prove the existence of an international legal system, but rather the existence of an important mechanism for serving and advancing political interests internationally. Sovereignty and the equality of nations. According to Morgenthau, current structure of international relations is at variance with the reality of international politics. Although the structure is founded on the participation of sovereign states, the reality is that international politics are dominated by an extreme inequality of nations. Morgenthau argues that it is this contrast and incompatibility between the reality of international politics and the concepts, institutions, and procedures designed to make intelligible and control the dominant nations that have caused, at least below the great power level, the unmanageability of international relations that currently borders on anarchy. For these reasons, I argue that sovereignty and the equality of nations by definition required for an effective international legal system does not currently exist. The question that remains then is if those dominant states are by definition sovereign, meaning not subject to external sources of authority, how is it possible to conceive of a system of law that will regulate their conduct, to allow for the transformation required to establish equality amongst all nations.